Hey, welcome back to the third edition of Same Sex Attraction. We have been talking about a lot of things, both biblically and just through some of the research on what some of the possible causes are or theories. This particular presentation, we're going to look at trying to build bridges to one another. One thing we have to admit, the church has messed up on how we have treated some people who deal with same sex attraction. We got to deal with that truth. We also want to balance that out and say that sometimes culture teaches things that may not be biblically true at all, or even true with research. So I'm going to try to share a few things on both sides of the equation, and most importantly, try to help that kid out there who's a teenager that's dealing with this, and they happen to come up and ask the question. Our definition of marriage, I think, is extremely important. And by the definition, I'm talking about God's definition of what I think He intended marriage to be. And some people, and if you'll listen very closely, a lot of people will have little posters that say we should be able to love whoever we want to love. And that is true. The question is that love just in general, or is that talking about marriage? And I would say that most Christians believe that marriage is between a man and a woman. Uh, and here are some of the marks of a marriage. One thing that marriage does is it brings them together, once again, in not only the agreement, commitment, but also in sexuality. It produces unity and companionship, and there is expected permanence to that relationship, that you will not leave that person until death do you part. So there is a belief, and God says it pretty strongly. What God has put together, man should not put asunder. Well, that is a quality that we need to be looking for in a marriage relationship. Secondly, it's procreative. In other words, it produces kids in life. The very first commandment that was given was be fruitful and multiply. Uh, those are just real basic things right off the bat. That's an expectation of what a marriage relationship is. Now, with gay couples, right away, we see in number two that it starts becoming an issue and a problem that doesn't quite fit the definition of what we'd expect from a marriage biblically. It can be instructional. Marriage can be instructional, as in if kids are produced in that, we consider it our job to produce spiritual formation in those kids. And that goes back to things like Deuteronomy 6, where Moses and the children of Israel were instructed on parents should be teaching their children when they wake up, when they lie down, write it across the doorpost. All those things were expectations of any marriage relationship. And then last of all, it's a physical example of what God's relationship to us is like, and to the Trinity. It produces spiritual understanding of that. Now, you would think society has no rules whatsoever on marriage, including the government. And the bottom line is, government does have rules about marriage. It has marriage rules like you can't marry your pet. You're not supposed to marry your sister, your aunt, your uncle. Uh, you can't marry several folks that the government comes up and says that that's not allowed. Obviously, the Supreme Court has opened the door for gay marriage, and so that has broadened, and there are actually people who are pushing for more definitions of marriage, such as in Britain. Right now, they are having a move, and they're actually doing this, where they are having marriages of three people. And of course, if you have three people, why not four, five, six, seven people who all love each other? Uh, that comes into play. And if it's happening in Britain, I would guess that you will be seeing it somewhere in the United States, or someone at least attempting to do that before too long. And that's why knowing and understanding what biblical marriage is going to become more important over the next few years. It seems like the uh, the world continues to search and look for how can we deconstruct what God has put together, so that marriage can become something very different than what God intended for it to be. And with every part of that that is deconstructed, I think you start to see marriage start to crumble a little bit more each and every time that they come up with something new and something novel in that. But that's what's really going on in the world, at least in Britain. Three people marriages, and some of that, frankly, is so that a couple, we may have a male and two females who are lesbians, that they do it that way so that they can have a child. So it can go back and check off that second line of this particular list we have. But let's talk about bridge building. How do we get to a place where we can start building bridges to each other? Here's the first one. The first thing I think we want to do is claim our identity as a child of God. If I were to ask any one of you to tell me who you are, there are many of you who would start out, my name is, and then you would tell me your major right now. You would tell me where you're from, and you tell me what you're involved in. And that would be it. But that really doesn't tell me your main identity. And I think your main identity is you're a child of God, at least those of you who are Christians in the room. The question that we come into play with this, and why this is so important, is there has been an attempt, and I don't think it's overt. I don't think it's strategic. I just think it has happened, in which our sexual identity has become more important than our identity as a child of God. And churches have fallen into this, calling people gay this or gay that. And it's very important to listen to the order of our words and which words we put first as we introduce one another. The church might be saying, well, that guy is a gay coach, or he's a gay teacher. Notice their sexual identity comes first, and then their profession of coach. If I were to ask any of the guys in the room what you're doing in 5 years to explain who you are, you would start out by saying, I'm a professor, or I'm an accountant, or I'm a lawyer. And you would start with your profession. Many times what I hear going on is we have even people who are gay using terms to describe themselves as, I'm a gay Christian, I'm a gay accountant, I'm a gay student, I'm a gay, and all of a sudden you see right off the bat, we're highlighting their sexual identity first, and the other identities come next. When I first started this class with you, I did not start the class out saying, my name is Robert Oglesby, and I'm a heterosexual, and I'm your professor for this semester. It sounds really strange, doesn't it? Well, I think so too. And I think it's a trap. I think something is going on in which we are trying to highlight something that should not be highlighted. It's just a subset of our personality. I would rather say I'm a child of God who happens to be a professor, who happens to be a husband, a father, and, oh, by the way, I am heterosexual. I think society's kind of done this to us and all, but bottom line is, claim your primary identity as a child of God first. So I am a child of God who struggles with pornography. I'm a child of God who struggles with greed. I'm a child of God who struggles with, you name it. Secondly, just want you to know biblical ethics bring order to society, that this is not just one issue. This is an issue for everyone. And I think one of the things that we need to go after is explaining to the world that we're not out to get gays. Number one, if we get them straightened up, the whole world would be a better place. Our problem is we need to straighten ourselves up. And there's plenty of sexual sin inside our churches. And it brings chaos. It brings trauma. It brings hurt and pain. And one of the things that we've got to do is address our own sexual ethics within the church itself. I think we have brought many, many people into our relationships, our conversations, talking about their problems instead of dealing with our problems. Now, as we deal with sexual ethics and what's going on, we also have to look at what's going on in reality in our culture. The Supreme Court ruling, let's take that. They came across and said, hey, we're making a new ruling, gay marriage is allowed. And I think there was this impression that all these gays who have been just waiting for this door to open would automatically run through that door and all go get married. And we have a nice little group of heterosexual couples and a nice group of gay couples who would also be married. I looked it up a year or two after the ruling just to see what was going on, because I was just curious what's going on out there among the gay population and their choice of marrying or not. Here's what happened. If you believe Gallup poll numbers, which would put the numbers somewhere around 7% of America, and then look at the numbers of LGBTQ potential couples that could have married when the door was open for them, I found that only 10% of those couples chose to marry. I couldn't figure out what was going on, why the numbers were not higher for that. And I asked actually a student who was gay that I knew, who was a college student. I said, tell me what's going on. And he said, at least my friends, we're not into marriage stuff, which told me he's not into that permanence factor of relationship. And once again, that's okay for him to have that opinion and thought. But I began to look back at what was the design for marriage. It's for permanence. And it doesn't seem that this seems to be shared by at least this initial group of people as they had the chance to marry. So once again, just something to think about, and that's something to watch on the impact of society. Number 3, don't mistake temptation for sin. I think we've covered this already when we talked about lust, but bottom line is, if the church is going to redeem some folks dealing with any sexual integrity issue, we've got to understand temptation is not a sin, and we cannot call it such. There are actually some churches who I think imply that just the temptation is a sin. We can't go there if we want to build a bridge, because these bridges have to have some anchor points, and that's another anchor point. 4th, remember what our job is. Are you wondering what your job is as a Christian? Here's a great quote. I want you to see. Most of you remember Romans 1 as it talks about same-sex attraction, and one of the few times where it talks about men and women who are involved in this behavior. At the very end of that, chapter 1, read through the first part of Romans chapter 2, because it says, be careful about judging. Don't judge these people or any other people who are doing that nice little list of things that we see in 1 Corinthians 6, because it says that we too could fall into temptation. So here's our job as far as it has been told, I think, biblically. Holy Spirit's job is to convict the hearts. It's the part of our heart that says something's not right. It's not holy. And it's God's job to judge, which means the judge's bench is already taken. I don't need to be sitting in it. What's our job? Our job is to love these people. Love all people. And we're going to leave it up to God to make the judgment call on Judgment Day. I had actually a student at ACU ask me my opinion about this who's not in this class. And I told them some basics, but bottom line is they said, well, are they going to go to heaven? I said, it's not my job. Not my job. I teach what the Bible, I think, teaches, and I'm going to leave up that job up to God and let him do that work. So remember what our job is on that. Some other how to build some bridges. Some more anchor points. Are we all willing to submit to God's will in our lives? And that's not just for them, that's for us. Are you willing to do whatever God has called you to do? That's a good starting point for any discussions that we have with anybody. And I think they can ask us some pretty hard questions as well. Have you submitted your will to God? One of the things that Jesus is such a great example of is looking at the cross and then looking at his Father and saying, if there's any other way, Lord, Father, can we think of that? Can we do something different? And yet he says, not my will, but thine be done. Oh man, that's pretty incredible. That is the peak of submission for that. Second, we need to seek to understand each person's journey. How do you do that? You listen. You listen very carefully to their journey. You listen to how they got where they are, and hopefully they can listen to where you came from as well. So this brings what I call the grace moment for all of us. They tell a story of a man. He was on a subway in New York City, and his kids got on, and they weren't very old, and it was pretty obvious very quickly the kids were going absolutely crazy on the subway car, and they were causing everybody on the subway car to be uncomfortable because of how wild they were and loud they were. And everyone kind of looked at the dad thinking, what are you going to do? When are you going to do something about these kids? They're driving everybody crazy on this subway. And one of the men close by to the dad leaned over and said, boy, it looks like you got your hands full. And the man said, well, I really do now, because these kids' mother died about 4 hours ago at the hospital. I'm taking them home for the first time in weeks. And all of a sudden, the dad, he saw the dad in a very different light. And so the man hopped up and began to ask the kids questions and got him to calm down by himself. And all of a sudden, the subway car became a holy ground. And what everybody thought was a big hassle, all of a sudden, the word spread among the car about these kids' mother passing away. And that's pretty true for all of us, that if we understand each other's journey, we understand what the other person struggles with, it really brings grace into the equation. We give them extra grace at times because we go, oh, I understand it. I get it now. And that's one of the things with all of our journeys. We need to extend grace. There are some things that we don't find out about each other until maybe it's a crisis moment. But those are the things that I think will help us build a bridge to each other. Obviously, be careful with vocabulary and trap phrases. Obviously, we talked even before we broke for this very long spring break about using terms that are offensive. And I'm going to tell you one that I think we need to be careful about. That's the term homosexual. Now, I know I've said it, and I've even used it as I've read it in class, but here's the problem with it. When a gay person hears the term homosexual, they think of the Bible, they think of Christian, they think of anti-gay, which means anti-me. If they want to be called gay, call them gay. I don't think that's going to hurt anything. I think you in your head may say homosexual, but you're going to translate it to gay to not be offensive to them. Why start off offending someone if you're trying to actually build a bridge toward them? If gay helps that conversation go better and opens up better, use the term gay. Same-sex attraction, same deal. If they like to use that, that's great. The main thing is just try not to be offensive. We have offended way too many people in the church. And I know we love that little phrase, quit using this love the sinner and hate the sin phrase. That has been used so much, and it sounds so Christian-y. And I believe it in principle, but believe me, gays do not hear that well. It doesn't fall on their ears well. How about we just love each other? And because we all know from Romans 3:23 that we are all sinners. So they could look right back at it and say, yeah, me too. I love you, the sinner, and I hate all your sin as well. Now, one thing back I want to address that we don't talk about very lot. This is probably not politically correct in any way, but you'll hear the term homophobic used a lot. It's thrown around a whole bunch, usually by gays who try to discredit the religious people or what they call the conservatives. But I want you to realize that they're doing the same thing by using terms that are one, not accurate, and two, that are offensive. Uh, for some Christians, homophobic, they're saying, I'm not homophobic. They may disagree and say, we think this is a sin, but each and every person that is out there who's a Christian is not homophobic. Some may struggle with it, yes, but I would say for the most part, the other side has tried to use this to create this hysteria that these people are ridiculous and crazy. And the fact is, most people are not in the Christian movement regarding that, at least. Okay, a few more things. Church must prove it loves and welcomes gay people because media tends to show the extremes. It'll show gays who are what we call flaming gay people. And those people are out there, and yes, they're there, but for the most part, that's not where most gays are. And also, it loves to use people like the Westboro Baptist Church that would go protest at funerals and hold up God hates fags and gays and all that stuff. Horrible. And the world sometimes looks up and says, well, all religious people are like that. Well, that's not true. And we can't all obviously say all gay people are this way. I liken it to, people who, especially see, well, how those Church of Christ people are, or how those Baptists are, or how those Methodists are, how those Catholics are. Well, no. Gays and Catholics and Church of Christ and Baptists, we're all very unique and very individual people. So try not to label with big, huge labels. And once again, we've got to start showing with our actions that we love one another. Jesus said, this is how you know my true disciples, if they have love for one another. And so he calls the world to look at us, consider us, look at what's going on in our actions, and says, those are the people who are loving, those are my people. And so we've got to start showing that a little more overtly than just putting that on a bulletin or on a sign out front in the building. We need to get out there and help people. From the book Andrew Marin wrote called Us Versus Us, he says 54% of all LGBTQ students leave the church after age 18. So we're losing half of them right after 18. 76% of all LGBTQ are that left out of that group. 76% are open to returning to the religious communities. What does that tell you? They still have a spiritual need. They still have a spiritual want. They want to be a part of a community that follows Jesus. So they are not a bunch of unspiritual people. They are not people who are out after overt rebellion to God. They really do want to love God, but they feel like they've been pushed out or marginalized. And look at this last one. 80% of all students continue their spiritual practices like prayer after leaving church. That's pretty incredible. I think that's a real testimony to what's going on in their hearts. Another big bridge that I want us to really look at is disagreement does not mean we love each other. I think this is what we've got to model is disagree, but don't be disagreeable. Don't hack them off. I call them homosexual. Try to be welcoming, talking with them. You may not agree with their personal choice, but teach with gentleness and the gentleness of Jesus. Galatians 6:1 talks about when you find someone who's in a sin, you treat it with great gentleness, confront it with great gentleness. And that trait comes out so incredibly strong in all the Jesus stories that we've talked about. Jesus was so kind to the sinners, to the prostitutes. He spoke so tenderly to them, and yet was pretty rough on the Sadducees and Pharisees. One of the things I want us to continue to look at is see church as family, and when we disagree in our families, we we may have a real tough time, especially during this pandemic. You may have had some pretty strong arguments, but you know what? You're still family when it's over. When we get back to the new normal, we're still going to be family. And that's exactly what Jesus is trying to call us to, is that just because someone doesn't agree with each other does not mean the love stops. We want to do it Jesus' way, right? I think that's big. If we can, we're going to apologize for the hurt, even if we didn't cause it. There was a time in ACU's history in which we did not let African American or Hispanic students into our college. And Royce Money was not the president of ACU at that time. But you know what? A few years back, he went to a primarily African American college and apologized for something he wasn't personally responsible for, but institutionally he felt like ACU needed to apologize. And he did. And it was a very healing thing for those of color who said, "Oh, finally you recognized it at last." And of course, we've come a long way since then, and I'm glad we've come a long way. Another guy, they come out of the closet. I want you to know that what happens next is going to determine whether there's a second conversation. Here are 4 things that I want you to remember, and remember very well. And go teach this as well. Don't just leave this in a class in your notes. Take this with you. Share this with other people, because I think it's really important for the kid who is petrified to share who they are. First of all, thank them for their courage and thank them for their trust. That's really big. Another big message is God wants you here. By here, I'm saying in church. A bigger question is, I want you here. Most kids deep down fundamentally know that God still loves them. The question is, do you, after they have shared this part of them with you? They need to hear that out loud, verbally, and they don't need to hear it just one time. You tell them constantly, I want you here, I want you here. And the last one, can I walk with you through the journey? This is not just a one conversation topic. This is a journey. And I think part of that journey is going to be you listening very carefully, helping them, dealing with them in whatever they are going through at the time. Remember your house's words that it may be words like this is not a settled identity at this point. Let's explore it together. Can I walk with you in that journey? It may be, I'm going to go tell my parents next. Would you like me to go with you to tell your parents? It may be, well, your parents threw you out after they found out. Can I keep walking with you? Can I help you find a place to stay? Can I help you continue to walk when your parents have thrown you out? A lot of those bad scenarios are going to come into play, and some of them are good and some of them are bad, but bottom line is they need someone to continue to walk with, and that's what I think can really help you. So what does this mean for the church? Church is a variety of approaches. I'm going to show you 4 that I would just kind of categorize. The judgmental, obviously, are the ones that I doubt most of you would want to go to. They're going to be very judgmental. It's kind of the Westboro Baptist model. Sorry to all the Baptists out there. They just happen to be Baptist. And all Baptist churches are not like them, obviously. But Westboro was pretty bad. Protesting at funerals, going to college campuses. They just had a horrible lack of understanding of the difference between temptation and actual behavior. So that's rough. Now there's that second church, and we saw this from some of the churches that you'll see are very welcoming of people who deal with same-sex attraction, but they may limit involvement. They don't want them to be in leadership roles, at least. So that's obviously a better direction than the judgmental. Then you have the inclusive, which is, can we journey together with you in this? They're going to protect those who are gay, but also say, God is not through with you yet. He's not through with me yet. And we're going to be discipling one another together across time. And then last of all is the church that's probably the most controversial, and that is the affirming church, where gay behavior is not a sin. And obviously gay marriage would be allowed. In fact, let me put it on there. Some of the things that become a dividing point for some of the Christian folks that you and I will deal with is some feel like this type of inclusive behavior is really good, and others are going to see this as heresy in the Christian faith. You're going to have to make up your mind for yourself. I think I've told you, I think there's some real fallacies and some problems with gay marriage and gay behavior, but you're going to have to figure out, what type of church do I want to be a part of long term? What church represents the Spirit of Jesus in this? And so as you kind of look and see how churches have dealt with this, this may help you a little bit as we go. There's always some questions like, I don't think this is fair, that it seems like church is picking on gay people, and the heterosexual Christians seem to have a free ride or a free pass on this. Let me show you a passage. It's in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And this is written by Paul. He was Saul at one time. He was Paul. He wrote about half of the New Testament. And he comes to this little verse. It's a verse that we don't talk about a whole lot, but you probably have heard about it before. There was given to me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. Well, this is one of God's guys. If there was anybody who put it all on the line, who is all in for the Lord, it was Paul. And yet, here he was begging, please take this thorn in my flesh. We don't know exactly what it was, but we know it was something that was tormenting to him. It was obviously something that was repetitive, came after him many times, and Paul 3 times said, take it away, and the Lord says no. He says no to his guy, to the guy who got stoned and flogged and shipwrecked and did it all for the mission of God. The Lord himself says, no, my grace is sufficient. My power is made perfect in even weaknesses. Wow. If you think that the Lord has it out for you, I want you to come back to this passage. I'm not sure I will ever do as much for the Lord as Paul did. But even the Lord told Paul no. He said, don't worry about it. I got it covered. My grace will cover whatever you're struggling with. And he told his guy no. That's what we have to deal with, is that the Bible is not always, everything works out perfectly for those who love the Lord. He just says, I'm going to be with you. That's what makes it okay. And his grace makes it okay. You remember there was that chapter over in 1 Corinthians 6 about all those things, and obviously homosexual activity was in there, in that list, but greed and slander and all those things, and adultery. And at the end of that list, here's what the writer says. And that is what some of you, catch this tense, were. But you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, and by the Spirit of God, you were saved. Now, I'm not sure all those people quit having adulterous affairs. I think they changed their ways at some level, but they may still struggle with it. But he's saying to them, that's not how I see you anymore. That's not how you, that's not your identity. You are a child of the Lord Jesus Christ. A spirit of the Lord is on you. and you are one of my children. I think it's a tough. This is a tough issue, and I hope you struggle with it. I hope you deal with it in your own time. Think through some of the things we've talked about. Keep looking and keep watching what's happening in culture to see if God didn't have some pretty good ideas that we don't want to get too far away from. Anyway, I hope everybody's doing well. Y'all have a blessed day. Bye bye.